no president will make you and I rich. We got to do that on our own. Now that we have that disclaimer out of the way, big news coming from the US. Trump wins the election. And while you might be happy, not so happy, or neutral about it, this video is about how he can put Canada into a recession and take your job away from you. So let's get started. So Trump won the election. It means a lot for the US economy, but what does it mean directly for the Canadian economy? There are two things that can happen. There's a social impact and there's an economic impact. You have seen this a lot if you have been following the news, what it means for Canada. And the big one is that Trump, being Trump, his favorite thing is mass deportation. He hates people without papers. He does cause a lot of trouble for people, even on work permit, who are skilled, who are working in IT companies on H-1B visas. He doesn't give green cards. So it's very known from his first tenure that he's not a huge fan of immigration, and that basically means that there will be a lot more asylum seekers coming to Canada. However, the good thing is in March of 2023, in the Biden administration, Biden and Trudeau came to an agreement. It's called the Safe Third Country Agreement, which says that if you cross the border to make an asylum, so if someone from the US comes to Canada seeking asylum and they don't meet one of the criteria or the criteria for Canada to take them in, they can actually send them back to US. And this agreement works both ways. So if there's someone who comes from Canada and seeks asylum in the US, and if don't qualify for that asylum, they can actually send them back to Canada. So this is something that has come into effect now. We don't know whether how foolproof this agreement is, whether it will change, and we also don't know how Trudeau's administration, who is changing the immigration policies now, but in the past they've been seen to be very open to asylum seekers, to refugees. We don't know how they'll respond. Maybe they'll invite them with open arms. I hope not, because anyways have a lot more population that infrastructure can handle. There are not enough jobs, but we'll see, and that could cause a social impact which is more related to immigration, and that would be a big one to see how that plays out. But the bigger one, and this is probably the most important thing that we need to see in the coming years, months and years, on what he does, that Trump is in love with tariffs. And I'll talk about what tariffs are, but take it as an additional tax on every import coming into the US. So if someone is sent to US, that's something that they are importing to US because they probably don't make enough of it, or they are not making anything at all, or there's a surplus in another country. It's a part of their trade agreements, and right now there are zero tariffs, and this is an agreement, a treaty that was signed between US, Mexico, and Canada, USMACA, which is US, Mexico, and Canada. And this came into effect in 2020, and in fact, it was Trump's administration that actually signed this treaty, and it will be reviewed on July 1st, 2026. And as per this particular treaty, it allows for $0 tariffs, so there are no tariffs on 99% of goods that move between Canada and US borders, which is amazing because that basically means that Canada is able to export a lot of their surplus and make a lot of, it actually makes a lot of, Canada's GDP. And this particular agreement is really critical, but it is under review on July 1st, 2026. So there is a chance that if USA puts tariffs on all countries, there is at least a 10% tariff that will be put on all imports coming into the USA from Canada. Now, the question is, how big will this impact be, and what does it actually impact? Which jobs does it impact? Does it impact jobs or not? So US and Canada trade relations have been long-standing for a very long time. $3.6 billion of goods are transferred between the two countries across the borders. Canada buys about $372 billion of all US exports. So $372 billion is a big number, and that is equivalent to 17% of everything that US exports anywhere in the world. So it's equally important for the US to maintain this relationship the way it is, because 17% of everything that US exports is coming to Canada. Whereas on the other hand, US buys $436 billion of Canada exports, and that is 75% of everything that Canada exports across the world. So yes, if the tariffs come into play, it will impact both countries, but Canada will be a lot more hit because everything that goes out, 75% of it is actually going to the US. And if there are additional tariffs that are put on those goods, it will be a problem. Now let's look at what is it that these countries are exchanging. What is it that goes to Canada? And these are a little bit older numbers. These are 2022. So the numbers that I showed you are more recent, 2023 and 2024. So imports, and this is like a government document that I'm citing from. It is an analysis of the US trades with Canada. This was done in 2022. And imports from Canada by sector. So this is something that US buys from Canada. So that's about $436 billion, and the biggest one, 36%, is oil, minerals, lime, and cement. This is a really big part of the export that happens from Canada to US. So US US buys a lot of oil. It's then refined and sent. You must have read this or heard this from many people. Canada doesn't refine its own oil. It actually sends it to US. US refines it and sends it back to Canada. And then there's transportation equipment that goes, and then there is chemicals, plastics, rubber, textiles, footwear. So there's a lot of raw material, agricultural products which are exported between the two countries, and then same way there are some US exports that happen to Canada as well, and that includes machinery, mechanical appliances, followed by I think it's transportation equipment, then chemicals, plastics. So some of it comes from Canada, some of it comes from US, and they just enjoy the perks of not paying any tariffs right now as per the treaty that we have. However, this can all change. Now the question is, why would Trump want to put tariffs on a relationship which is actually working pretty well? And the answer is, imagine you and me are doing trade. I give you $436 billion of business, but you only give me $372 billion of business, which is exactly what is happening with US right now. Between US and Canada, there's a deficit of $64 billion. So that basically means that Canada is taking more than what they are giving to the US economy. And that is where the deficit comes from. And that's the reason why Trudeau wants to put tariffs on Canadian goods coming into the US, so that there is less demand for Canadian goods. This deficit reduces. There is more demand for the same goods that are produced in Canada. Those demand actually moves to the US manufactured goods. There is more jobs being created in the US, and that would help the US economy. Or at least in the long term, it might help, but in the short run, there'll be a lot of pain, and we'll talk about that. That's exactly why Trump wants to put tariffs, and not just on Canada. He's actually talking about putting 10 to 20% and up to 60% tariffs on countries like China. And the reason is that, yes, there is a trade deficit between Canada and US probably wants to fix that, but the bigger fish to fry is something else. The real target is not Canada in all this. Total US trade deficit with the world is almost $1 trillion, and almost 30%, 30 to 35%, a third of all the deficit is happening between China and US. So China is actually taking a lot more. If you look at the chart, you'll see this blue dot, which is exports that happen from the US to other countries, and you'll see that Canada is one of the highest. And, I don't think this deficit is big enough. The bigger fish to fry, like I said, is China. But if Trump decides to put a blanket tariff on every country, some countries would have more, some countries would have less. And if the 10% tariff actually comes into play, it will be a huge problem for Canada. It will just be a collateral damage, honestly, but it would impact their economy a lot. And I'll tell you why. Let's first understand how do tariffs actually work. So let's assume that there's a 10% tariff on all breads coming from Canada. So Canada is a huge exporter of bread, cakes, biscuits, cookies, and 95% of everything that's exported out of Canada actually goes to the US. So baked goods are a big export that happens from Canada into the US. So let's assume right now there's zero tariff on that. It comes under the USMCA agreement. But if there's a 10% tariff that is put on all breads coming from Canada, what would happen is the US consumer will pay more for Canadian bread, because what happens is that, if there's a 10% tariff, there's a very high chance that that cannot be absorbed by the companies. So that has to be passed on to the US consumer. And it's a fallacy that when a country put tariffs on another country, it's not the other country that pays for it. It's their own country that pays for it. But there is a series of events that happens. So the US consumer will actually pay more for Canadian bread, and then US consumer will be like, why should I pay more for Canadian bread when I can actually buy a US bread for same or cheaper price, which is exactly what Trump wants. He wants more consumption of domestic products. But the US bread manufacturers would be like, this is amazing. This is like more business, amazing. We love it. But we have to put a more plant now, because suddenly there's a lot of demand for bread. We can't meet the bread with the current supply chain that we have. So let's increase the price of our bread. And therefore, to meet this demand, they have to set up a plant. They have to increase the price of the bread, because now there's more demand. And now the US consumer has to pay more for any bread, not just Canadian bread, but even US bread. Now, again, I'm talking about bread, but this is just an example. Tariffs can actually be put on anything. It could be on oil, minerals, certain things that impact. Plastics, for instance, will impact a lot of consumer goods. But this is just an example. And finally, the Canada bread maker. They are the manufacturers who were exporting a lot of the material to US. And because now the US demand is less, they'll either have to shut down their factories and fire the employees, or they'll have to increase the price domestically. And in both these cases, it will not be good for the Canadian economy. Either people will lose jobs, and the cost of the bread will also increase. And like I said, it's not just about the bread and cakes. It's about plastics. It's about minerals. It's about oil. It's about everything these tariffs can impact, and overall inflation will actually go up. Now, the other thing that happens is, and this happens every time, if US put tariffs on certain things, Canada can also retaliate. And let's assume that Canada puts 10% tariffs on cars. And I'm just, making assumptions here. I'm just trying to explain how tariffs actually work. Now, it might not be that it's on cars or bread or anything, right? It might not even happen, right? So, but let me just, try to explain, and, for theoretical purposes, let's just understand how tariffs work. Let's say Canada retaliates and put 10% tariffs on all cars. There are some really, really good cars. Tesla is becoming very very popular: Lincoln, Ford, Jeep. There are so many trucks that are, Cadillac. There's so many different cars which Canadians love. And in this case, what happens is Canada consumer will have to pay more for US cars. Again, they'll not be able to absorb the 10% tariffs. They'll have to pass it on to the consumers, and Canada will have to pay more for US cars. And then Canada consumer will be like, oh, why should we buy US cars now? We should just buy the same or cheaper car which is available in Canada or from any other country. And then the other car manufacturers will be like, okay, amazing, more business, amazing, but we don't have a plant. We'll have to increase our capacity, and therefore to meet this increased demand, which is sudden, let's just increase the price to meet this demand. And that would mean that Canada consumer actually pays more for any car, not just US car, but they will actually pay more for any car. And US car manufacturer will say that, oh, I was actually exporting a lot to Canada, and now that demand is gone, and I either have to scale back my plant, or I have to fire employees, or I'll have to increase price domestically, so no one wins. When tariffs are put, in the short run, no one wins. Yes, in the long term, there'll be more consumption. Once the capacity is increased, there'll be more domestic consumption. We have seen that in India. We have seen that in China, where the population can actually support all this, manufacturing. But in countries which are heavily dependent on exports, when you put tariffs, everything gets expensive in the short run, and it helps no one. In fact, if you look at Canada, 75% of all Canada exports happen into the US. And if that tariffs are put, let's say a 10% tariff is put, 33% of all Canada's GDP is dependent on exports. And because 75% of that 33% is US, that means that 25% of Canada's GDP is dependent on US exports, which is bizarre. But the same is not true. If Canada decides to retaliate and say that, oh, I'll be putting a 10 to 20% tariff on US exports, it's not going to impact US as much, because only 10% of US GDP is dependent on exports, and only 17% of this 10%, which is less than 2% of US GDP, is dependent on Canada exports. So yes, there will be an impact on the GDP for both countries, but Canada has a lot to lose, because 25% of the Canadian GDP is dependent on US exports versus 2% of US GDP, which is dependent on Canadian exports. That basically means that Canada's GDP can contract by 2 to 5% if US puts 10 to 20% tariffs on all exports from Canada to US, which will lead to inflation, like we explained in the example. It will lead to recession, because there'll be so many people who will be losing jobs. The disposable income in the economy will reduce. And in order to fill the deficit that Canada will incur with these tariffs and with this reduced export, Canada will have to increase taxes. And that's exactly how Trump putting tariffs on Canada and the world will impact our economy really badly. Now, I started this video by saying that no president can save you. A lot of people were happy that Trump won. Oh, because Trump won, maybe polyamorous. I'm not politically affiliated to anyone. I'm just looking at it from a neutral point of view of how does it impact me and what should I do. And here's, a few suggestions here, because no president is going to save us. We'll have to save. The silver lining is that Trump is good for US businesses. It does improve the amount, we've seen this, right? So when Trump was there, it was really good for US business. US tech companies thrived. He was much quicker to make decisions when it comes to passing laws that could just thrive innovation. So all that is really good in Trump administration. We have seen that in the past as well. So I am personally investing 80% of my money in the US stock market, which is VFV, XQQ, and tech stocks. I'll actually put a video in the description. You can actually watch the number of stocks that I buy, and I have less than 5% exposure to Canadian stocks, because irrespective of whether the tariffs are put or not, I am more bullish now on the US stock market, and I have been for the last 1 year. And 80% of all my money that goes into the stock market goes to the US based stocks and not Canadian stocks. And in fact, I've stopped investing in the Canadian market for the last 6 months. But that's just a personal preference. I just feel that Trump will be good for the US businesses, not so much for the Canadian businesses. The second one is working class, T4 income, people who have jobs. Will be taxed more, and this is just a consequence. It was any which way is happening. There's so much debt with the Canadian economy, and the only way to pay interest on those debts is to tax people more. And one of the things that I'll highly recommend is starting a business might be the way to go. And I will in the next few weeks launch a business accelerator program, and that will happen next year. It will be in January or February. So do let me know in the comments if you are someone who is interested in that. But that is something that I will be looking to launch next year, because I really want that we as a community decide to take reins into our hand. We are not dependent on people taxing us more. We are not dependent on these tariffs taking away our jobs. We are just not dependent solely on these economic factors that can impact our livelihood, that can impact our families. And that's why I'll be starting this business accelerator program very soon. So do let me in the comments if you are interested in something like that, so that I know how much interest is there. And then the third one is impact on Canada real estate. Now, a lot of people are saying that, oh, Canada's real estate will do this or that. The interest rates will go up and down. Honestly, interest rates, I have said this many times, there's no one president or prime minister can actually change the course of interest rates. It's highly dependent on what's happening in the bond market. It's highly dependent on what's happening in the overall, like the world economy. I don't think, like these small ups and downs in the fixed rates has anything to do with the presidential elections. Yes, in the short run, maybe the fixed rates will go up, but that's not a long-term, they'll not have any long-term impact. However, the bigger impact on real estate will be, it will depend on how Canada tackles immigration, increased immigration from the US, and not just asylum seekers, but also skilled work permit holders. In Trump administration, they might not get green cards, and therefore they might not feel stable. And all these skilled labor might also want to move to Canada. And in fact, it was very interesting to me that when Trump won, Google, the amount of searches that happened to moving to Canada actually increased like astronomically, right? So there's just one stat that I saw. It was very interesting to me. I don't think people should move to Canada because Canada has its problems as well. But for some people, it's not an option. They have to move to Canada because US is not giving them, green cards, and they need some stability. They are building families, and therefore they either go back to their home countries or they look at Canada because it's relatively easier. And the reason why I'm saying this is because it will impact real estate, because if immigration to Canada increases because there's mass deportation from the US, I'm hoping that doesn't happen. But if it does, it will increase the amount of demand for Canadian real estate, and we have a supply problem which is persistent, and we are not building enough homes. We already have more people. Infrastructure is under a lot of pressure, and I think that will not be good for anyone who is looking for a home in the next 5 years. And anyways, the Canadian real estate is going up because of all the policy changes which are internal to Canada. This will just put another set of pressure on the Canadian real estate, and it might get out of hand, and it might get out of reach for most people, especially our kids. I'm worried about our kids who will not be able to afford a home ever, even if they have help from us and parents. But anyways, this is all speculation. I hope you at least understood how tariffs work. I hope you understood the impact that it will have. It's still premature to say what Trump would do. He'll come into power mid of January. We'll see. He said that in the first 100 days he'll be putting tariffs, but I don't know how this agreement that is in place till 2026. Maybe nothing happens till 2026, and after that, there's a negotiation that happens. It's still yet to be seen. But the intention of making this video was to make you understand how tariffs work, what they are, and if nothing, just increase our knowledge on how this election impacted Canada. I hope you like this video. मिलते हैं अगली वीडियो में, तब तक के लिए बाय बाय.